Today we're going to look at how to update the firmware on a Nikon Z Series camera. So in a video just a few weeks ago, I talked about some of the things I'd like to see Nikon do for its existing customers, and some of those involved firmware updates. Things they could improve through firmware, either bug fixes, things that weren't working quite right that they could fix through an updated firmware version, or some small features they could add. And I talked about a couple different features they could add, but at the end of the day, firmware for today's camera manufacturers is a great way to continue to support their users of their camera systems who are out in the field. Those little small tweaks might not seem like much, but it sort of gives extra value to camera and lets you know it's being supported by the manufacturer. So I think firmware updates are an important tool for camera manufacturers to sort of keep providing that extra value for a camera. So one of the things I talked about in that video was about the Nikon Z8 and why I wasn't really upgrading to it, but some of the features I'd like to see sort of trickle down to some of the previous camera systems. Well, one of those was the warm display option. Something so that if you're shooting in those very early morning hours where you're not going to mess up your night vision, probably more important for an astrophotographer, but even in those early morning hours or late evening hours, post-sunset, blue hour type things, where you just don't really want to disrupt your vision, I thought a warm display option could be nice. And I mentioned that as one of the things I'd like to see to come to the previous camera systems. Well, someone commented on that video that Nikon actually had added that feature in their most recent version of firmware for the Nikon Z series of cameras, specifically at least the Z6 II and the Z7 II. I had somehow missed that in the release notes, so I thought this would be a good opportunity to look at how to update the firmware on a Nikon Z series camera. We'll be doing the firmware update on a Nikon Z6 II, but it works very similarly across the other Nikon Z series cameras, and we'll be going to the Nikon website. We'll be getting the most recent version of firmware, the one that has the warm display option. We'll be putting it on the camera and just confirming the update took by checking the firmware version and taking a quick peek at the warm display option on the Z6 II. So let's dive in and walk through the process. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to check the version of firmware we have on the camera already. This is where you're going to go to do the update anyway, so it's good to get yourself familiar with it. See what version of firmware you have so that when you get to the website you can be sure you're getting one that's newer, or maybe you'll find out you've already got the most current. So to do that, just turn your camera on, go to Menu. So you're going to scroll down to the Setup menu. Once you're in there, you're going to scroll way down. Firmware is at the very bottom, so you go through several pages worth of information, and you are looking for the one that says firmware version. It's usually the last one on the screen. Once you have firmware version there, hit OK. So now you're in the firmware version. Now I don't have a lens on this camera, so it's only showing me the firmware of the camera just to keep things simple. It has a C in front of it, so it's the camera's firmware. If you have a lens on here, it could be showing you the camera's firmware version and the lens firmware. But for this, just C for camera. And we can see I've got version 1.20 on here. So that's my version of firmware. And now we can head to the website, find the firmware for this, and see if there's one newer for the Z6 II. So let's hop in and do that. So to actually find the firmware and figure out if we have the most recent version, we're just going to go to Nikon's website. I'm based out of the US, so we're going to go to nikonusa.com, and we'll go there. Once we're on Nikon's website, go to Software, Firmware Updates, because that's what we're looking to update. Takes us to the Download Center, where we can either search by the product name, or we can choose our category. Just to keep things simple, we're going to go Category, Mirrorless Cameras. I can choose Nikon Z Series. And here I have a list of various Nikon cameras I can choose from, including the Nikon Z6 II, which is what we're updating today, so that's what we'll click. And that takes us to the Z6 II page. This is where we're going to do all sorts of downloads. If you're looking for your camera manual, that's here. But what we're here for today is the firmware. And we take a look down here after I clicked on firmware, and I've got Z6 II firmware version 1.60. So I'm actually a little behind on my firmware on this camera. I was on 1.20 on my current camera, and they're up to 1.60. Now I do keep an eye on the firmware updates, but I tend to only update if I'm actively being affected by a bug that maybe the firmware fixes. Sometimes it happens because the firmware comes out during one of my busy seasons where I don't want to risk the firmware update and something going wrong. But today we're going to grab the 1.60 version and go from there. So we're going to view the download page. So on the download page, I'm on a Mac to do this download, but the Windows option is over here as well. And you can real quick and check and see what changed from version 1.5 to 1.6. And there's several things that changed in this one. What I'm looking for, why I'm specifically here for this version of firmware, is it added D10 under the custom setting menu for the warm display colors. That's what we're after, and that's the biggest motivator for me right now to grab this version of firmware. So there are directions on how to do this on the website, so if you're getting confused or getting lost or not understanding something, it's right here underneath updating the camera firmware. It's step by step, 7 steps, including a more in-depth guide available for download. So if this video you're still feeling a little nervous about updating the firmware, just take a look at these steps. There's 7 of them laid out pretty clearly right here, or you can grab the guide. So there is help for you once you get to the firmware page on how to do this. Anyways, we scroll down, accept the end user license agreement, and we're going to download this file. Okay, so we've got the firmware downloaded, so now we're going to pop into the folder, and on a Mac it's a DMG file. On a Windows computer it would be an exe file, but we double click it, it's going to open it up, and inside what I'm looking for is the .bin file. The .bin file is what's going to go on my CF Express card or my SD card to actually put in the camera to do the update. So for this I have just a blank free 32 gig SD card that I use for the firmware updates, older card, it's just sort of what I have. So what I need to do with this card is copy this .bin file to the top level directory on it. So we're going to put it into my card reader here. I'm going to plug it into the laptop. And what we're going to do is we're just going to take this bin file and we're going to Command C or Control C and we're going to copy it to my SD card. So I've got my SD card right here. And this is the key part and probably where a lot of people get confused. You don't want to put it in one of these subfolders. You don't want to put it in the DCIM folder or the Nikon folder. It goes in the root of the SD card. So at the very top, not a subfolder or anything like that. So as you can see, I've got the Z6_2_0160.bin. Again, that's important. The other area where people get confused is they'll sometimes drag the whole executable over the .exe file or the DMG file and then not be sure why their update isn't happening. You download the DMG or the exe, open it up, and then take the bin file out and put it on the SD card. So I've got that successfully copied. So what we're going to do is we're going to eject this from the computer and we're going to put it in the camera. So let's eject this, pop this out. So grab the camera, put this SD card. The only thing it has on it, it was freshly formatted, is it only has the .bin file on it. So put it in the SD card slot, close things back up, and let's take a look at the back of the camera on how to do the update. Okay, we had a slight technical difficulty with the Nikon Z6 II update in that their camera recording software I used recorded the back of the screen, didn't record when it did the shift into the update. So I lost the whole part of how to get into the firmware update and kicking it off. So I'm going to re-record it. We're going to do it the old-fashioned way, the iPhone watching the back of the screen. So bear with me through this. It'll still work out pretty well, but it won't be quite as clean screens as I've had other parts of the video. The other thing to note too is the Z6 II was on 1.20 and my Z7 II was on 1.31, so there'll be some mismatch on what I'm saying I'm updating from as different pieces of this video get mixed in. Hopefully it's not too confusing. I think it'll work out. So let's start this. Okay, so we're going to come in here and we are going to hit the menu button down here. I am going to scroll down to Setup Menu. Scroll over, going to scroll down a whole lot, many screens, down to firmware version. This is where we checked it earlier in the video. Firmware version. Again, I had to switch over to my Z7 II, so when we look at this, it's the camera is at version 1.31. I have the SD card in here, and I put the Z7 II firmware on here, 1.60. So I've got that inside the camera, and then we come down to update. Because I have that SD card in there with the firmware on it, it gives me the update option. So I'm going to press update, say OK, and it's telling me I'm going from 1.31 to 1.60. Defaults to no. We're going to bump it up to yes. We're going to say OK, and it starts updating. Now it takes a little bit to do this update. On the Z6 II, it took right around 2 minutes, and it'll give you a little progress bar as it works through. I'm not going to make you wait through the whole 2 minutes on the video. We'll skip through, use some video edits to make this go a little faster. But that progress bar is going to continue to update, and it's going to make its way all the way across. Again, the important thing here is start this with a full battery. Don't turn the camera off during it. Don't go hitting buttons. Don't go doing anything like that. Just let it run its course. Progress bar will continue to go. Progress bar finishes. And it says update complete, turn the camera off. It doesn't do it for you. It doesn't reset for you. You just have to turn the camera off. So we're going to go ahead and turn the camera off here, just like it says. Update complete, turn the camera off. And we turn the camera off. Okay, so we turn the camera back on. Let's jump into the menu and check our firmware version, make sure we have what we expect, and then we'll check out those warm display settings. So we're going to click menu. We're going to scroll down to firmware version. This is where we check the firmware version. There we go. We've got version 1.60 for this C, which is camera. I don't have a lens on this camera still. It's just the camera, so it makes it nice and easy to see what firmware version it is. And we've got the most current version of firmware. So I did this so I could get the warm display settings. Let's just go take a quick peek at that and we'll wrap this thing up. So to do that, we're just going to do done. We're going to move back out. So warm display settings are supposed to be underneath the shooting display menu, the D menu. So we click in there, scroll down to D10. There it is, warm display colors. That's one of my new options. We're going to click into it. Got warm display color options. Got mode 1 or mode 2. Not 100% sure what the difference is. I'll have to go read on that, but let's click into mode 1. And there we go. There's my menu in the warm display settings. So this was a feature I was looking for. I mentioned in one of my previous videos, I wish they'd trickled us down through a firmware update. One of the commenters on that video let me know it actually had been rolled out in one of the previous versions. This version released in July, and we just walked through installing it and getting that feature added to the camera. So that's how you update the firmware on your Nikon Z Series camera. It really isn't that difficult. Like I said, if you need a little bit more guidance, the Nikon site has both a little 7-step quick process or a firmware update guide that you can check out. But hopefully this video helps you. If you did find this video useful, be sure to hit that like button. And if you see future landscape photography content from me, including tips, tricks, behind the scenes, mini gear reviews, be sure to click that subscribe button so you don't miss any landscape photography content from me in the future. And thank you for watching.